Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Believe it or not, we are here at the very end. We find ourselves now with a set of introductory comments to Goodbye My Fancy, a collection of 31 poems at the end with a little preface essay that's going to be quite fascinating that we will cover as well in this brief set of comments. Now, just to remind where we have been working through every poem of the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, beginning with that very introductory word, come, and that invitation word. And we've been together all the way through. At least that's our assumption here. Now, we want to remind ourselves that we're working at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist. And we want to remind you that we have now just finished with the first annex, as it's often referred to, stands at 70, and now we turn to the second annex, or the last poems of Leaves of Grass. And it's always going to be fascinating to know how to leave a collection of poems like Leaves of Grass. I think Whitman himself struggled with knowing how to leave this poem. So if you're feeling a little bit strange because you've been with us from the very beginning and now all of a sudden you look up and you go, whoa, wait a minute, we've only got 31 poems remaining. How do I feel about that? You are in good company. And I'll try and capture that in this introductory set of comments and as well in our study of the last 31 poems. I just want to remind you that, as we have said repeatedly, it's so important that we understand each of these poems is its own story. And because we are the stories that we say and tell and reflect upon over and over again, we are the stories that we accept. We're also the stories that we reject. It's significant, I think, in our study of this collection of poems that we would finish where we started. Now, again, just to remind, our learning theory is always about trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. And we learned this from our study, of course, of Leaves of Grass. The new is the new, as we have said it. The NEW is the KNEW, that cyclical understanding of knowledge. But I want to remind us of our annotative approach. That is to say, about any one of these 31 poems, we will ask simply three guiding questions. What does the text say? What does the text mean? And how can I relate to it in some meaningful way? At level 1, what does the text say? We're just simply summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? We subdivide it. 2A, themes, messages, and at 2B, that's the rhetorical reading, the literary analysis reading of Leaves of Grass. That is to say, what exactly is it that Whitman is doing in this collection of poems? And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate, because that's the fundamental, most important element of learning, how can I relate 3A to other titles that I have studied? Now, obviously, all of the preceding poems of Leaves of Grass will be on our radar, as of course will be other titles that we are familiar with. And then finally, and most significantly, how can I relate this information to myself personally? We will be asking that question as well. Now, as we have said a number of times before in earlier lectures, we also in room 303 are always playing around what we call our big 5. That is to say, about any given text, what does it have to say about epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, and finally theodicy? Let's just review them one last time together in this series at least. What do we mean by epistemology? Well, what can you know? That is to say, there is an absolutist position, I'm right and you're wrong. The only problem with that is, of course, terrible things sometimes happen, like people flying airplanes into buildings and lots of folks dying. So we have to make sure that if we're going to use the absolutist epistemological position, we have to be very careful about that. Of course, the extreme opposite of that is the relativist position, that is to say, there are no absolutes, there is no truth, which, because of the performative contradiction, seems to suggest there's at least one truth to say there are no truths. And to that degree, we're not going to obviously embrace that notion of the relativist position. Well, where can we land? Well, I think Whitman is the teacher, the great teacher of where we can land. That is to say, the fallibilist position epistemologically. Notice his use of the word perhaps, for example, in Leaves of Grass. That is to say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong which makes science science and not scientism, right? That is to say, the quest is always going to be hemmed in by that fallibilist epistemological position. We'll ask, where does Whitman come down on that one? Of course, ontology is the flip side of that coin. That is to say, who are you? Who am I? And all the way through Leaves of Grass, you'll notice that Whitman does say, of course I'm a body, but I'm also something else. There seems to be something else going on. And as we pointed out, you have to have a mind to argue there is no mind. You have to have a soul to argue there is no soul, etc., etc. Our next pair, that is to say psychology, sociology, the study of the individual mind, psychology, the study of the collective or group mind, that is to say sociology. What are the motivations? What are the anxieties? What are the fears? And obviously we're going to see a lot of that here in our final 31 poems. But I have argued in our study together in Talks with Walt that it's really that last one. It's that question of theodicy. Why must there be such terrible things that has to happen in the world? Of course, for Whitman, that will be the Great War. Interestingly, the preface that we will study here in a moment will end with what? Reflections on that Great War. It's going to have affected him profoundly. And he teaches us in Leaves of Grass, you can't ask when bad things happen, why did this happen to me? When bad things happen to us as a collective, why did this happen to us? But rather, why did it happen for me? Or why did it happen for us? Changing that 2 to a 4 for Whitman is going to allow you to not feel like you're a victim in a universe you have no control over. And for Whitman, that's at the heart, I believe, of his creation of Leaves of Grass. Now that takes us, of course, to our 5 perspectives, or our 5 P's on Whitman. And as we pointed out, there's way more than this, but for sure we're always concentrating on these 5. That is to say, Whitman is person, he has a biography. Here we're reading the final poems that he will compile for us as an old man. We're going to have a lot of emphasis on aging and dying. Whitman obviously is poet. He is a genius poet, although he didn't start out to be a poet, as we've pointed out. He started out being actually a person who built houses and worked with his hands, or set type in a printing press shop, and then came to the idea of being a poet later, which is going to be significant. I'll even comment on it in his preface here in a second. I think Whitman is pedagogue, the third of our P's. Whitman is teacher, instructor. Obviously, some of you smiling already, you know where we're headed. Back to Song of Myself 46, 47, he most honors my style. Who learns under it to destroy the teacher? I think Whitman as pedagogue is crucial. In other words, Whitman's always teaching, and that's central to our reading of Leaves of Grass. And he'll be teaching now in these final 31 poems. Whitman is politician, and his celebration of freedom, democracy, justice, equality, all of that's going to be central, as well as finally Whitman as philosopher. That is to say, from Socrates to Emerson and everybody in between, Whitman has been influenced. Now, we've commented that the best way to approach all of this study is to read it on your own first. I hope that you're annotating up your own personal copy and then come to our comments in some kind of help. Now, we've been referring to our Nortons to give us some background information. It's going to be hypercritical again that we do so. First of all, for the second annex, Nortons will say that there's a preface note which was printed in Leaves of Grass 1891 to 92 without change from the plates of the separately published Miscellanea. Goodbye, my fancy of 1891. Its manuscript is clearly written in black ink with comparatively little revisions, an indication, as the text itself reveals, of the relaxation, even gaiety, which the poet confesses, quote, I have in me perennially anyhow, end quote. The quatrain, Last Droplets, is going to be included in any collection that would have excluded poems and passages. Now this is a fascinating little preface. Let's just enjoy Whitman's conversational tone. You will know after you read this preface, which is the final bit of prose right at the very end, you will know why we called our series Talks with Walt, because there's so much conversationally going on here. This is the preface note to the second annex concluding Leaves of Grass, or L of G as he will say it, 1891. Had I not better withhold in this old age and paralysis of me such little tags and fringe dots, maybe specks, stains, as follow a long dusty journey and witness it afterward. I love that he talks about a dusty journey. This takes us, of course, back to Song of the Open Road, a foot and light-hearted, a take to the open road. I've probably not been enough afraid of careless touches from the first. There's a lot of critiquers of Leaves of Grass that would agree with what he just said. And am not now, nor of parrot-like repetitions, nor platitudes in the commonplace. Perhaps I am too democratic for such avoidances. Besides, it's not the verse field as originally planned by my theory, is not the verse field as originally planned by my theory now sufficiently illustrated. In other words, there's a plan, there's a meaning to his madness. And full time for me to silently retire. Indeed, amid no loud call or market for my sort of poetic utterance, Whitman, all the way to the end, couldn't believe it, that people just didn't embrace his poetry the way obviously his poetry became embraced after his life. In answer, or rather defiance, again, Whitman is Promethean, to that kind of well-put interrogation, here comes this little cluster in conclusion of my preceding clusters, though not at all clear that as here collated it is worth printing. Certainly I have nothing fresh to write. It's interesting that he would say that, and yet we're going to marvel still at some of the poems that will be included here. I while away the hours of my 72nd year, hours of forced confinement in my den. We think about the way in which he's going to picture himself now as kind of confined in a prison almost, we would say, by putting in shape this small old age collation. So he calls it an old age collation. And then he'll provide us with some lines that again are not actually in the second annex. Last droplets of and after spontaneous rain from many limpid distillations and past showers, will they germinate anything mere exhalations as they all are? The lands and seas, Americas, will they filter to any deep emotion, any heart and brain? And now back to the prose. However that may be, I feel like improving today's opportunity and wind up. During the last 2 years, I've sent out, in the lulls of illness and exhaustion, certain chirps, lingering, dying ones, probably, undoubtedly, which now I may as well gather and put in fair type, while able to see correctly. For my eyes plainly warn me they are dimming, and my brain more and more palpably neglects or refuses, month after month, even slight tasks or revisions. It's going to be sad, as we said in the first annex, to read some of the poems here contained, because it's going to be, a man who is in his last moments. He continues, in fact, here I am these current years, 1890 and 91, each successive fortnight getting stiffer and stuck deeper, much like some hard-cased, dilapidated, grim, ancient shellfish or time-banged conch. I mean, you can't come up with a more powerful word picture than time-banged conch. No legs, utterly non-locomotive, cast up high and dry on the shore sands, helpless to move anywhere, nothing left but behave myself quiet and while away the days yet assigned to discover if there is anything for the sad grim, if there's anything for the said grim and time-banged conch to be got at last out of inherited good spirits and primal buoyant center pulses down there deep somewhere within his gray, blurred old shell. I mean, this is amazing prose poetry, isn't it? And then, as right on cue, he will speak directly to you and me, as in his personal tone, as he loves to do. Reader, you must allow a little fun here. For one reason, there are too many of the following poemets about death, etc., and for another, the passing hours, July 5th, 1890, are so sunny fine. I told you, he said he wants to keep on the sunny side alive. And old as I am, I feel today almost a part of some frolicsome wave, or for sporting yet like a kid or kitten, probably a streak of physical adjustment and perfection here and now. I believe I have it in me, perennially anyhow, in parenthetics. Then, he continues, behind all, the deep down consolation. It is a glum one, but I dare not be sorry for the fact of it in the past, nor refrain from dwelling, even vaunting here at the end, that this late year's palsied old shorn and shellfish condition of me is the indubitable outcome and growth, now near for 20 years along, of too overzealous, overcontained, overcontinued bodily and emotional excitement and action through the times of 1862, 3, 4, and 5. Visiting and waiting on wounded and sick army volunteers, both sides. He always loves to point that out. He worked with as a wound dresser, he worked with both those of the North as well as the South. In campaigns or contests or after them, or in the hospitals or fields south of Washington City or in that place or elsewhere, those hot, sad, wrenching times. You'll remember his use of wrenching in Leaves of Grass. The Army volunteers, all states, or North or South, the wounded, suffering, dying, the exhausting, sweating summers, marches, battles, carnage, those trenches hurriedly heaped by the corpse thousands, mainly unknown. And then he asks the question that explains why we've been doing this reading from the beginning. And as I've argued to you guys, if you're not a patriot as a young person, it is not your fault. You're not born a patriot. If you're not a patriot, it's because nobody's giving you a reason to be a patriot, especially in my generation. One of the arguments we've made in reading Leaves of Grass is, you got to read it as is the reason to be a patriot? If I'm an American, do I have a reason to be proud of my country? Listen to what he says next. He does it in the form of a rhetorical question, which is compelling. Will the America of the future, that's you guys, will this vast, rich union ever realize what itself cost back there, after all. Quotation mark, or question mark. Those hecatombs of death, battle deaths, those times of which, O far-off reader, this whole book is indeed finally but a reminiscent memorial from thence by me to you. You'll remember in one of those inscription poems at the very beginning, my book and the war are one. Now, as we turn to the actual poems, Norton's will tell us the following about Goodbye My Fancy. The 31 poems of the second annex, Goodbye My Fancy, in Leaves of Grass 1891-92, had in some cases first been seen in periodical publication. They were then brought together in the first section of a miscellany of poetry and prose entitled Goodbye My Fancy 1891. Like the poems of the first annex, Sands 70, which were published in the miscellanea November Boughs 1888. These were written for the most part after the poet had felt it necessary to complete the arrangement of his poetry as a whole in Leaves of Grass because of failing health and creativity as explained in the previous annex, note, Sands 70. Like the first annex, the second contains poems, if not so many, which have genuine merits and are related usefully to the themes of the 1881 volume. Now, how are we going to approach this study? Well, I'm always interested in specifically what Whitman had to say about this cluster of poems. This is what he said. The clef is, quote, the clef is here charged to its lowest, and the little book is a lot of tremulous about old age, death, and faith. The physical just lingers, but almost vanishes. The book is garrulous, irascible, like old Lear, significant, that's where he goes, and has various breaks and even tricks to avoid monotony. It will have to be ciphered and ciphered out long, and is probably in some respects the most curious part of its author's baffling works. Now, it is significant that there are in fact two poems here that are still considered by scholars quite remarkable. The first one, Sunset Breeze, Ezra Pound said about that poem, quote, if a man has written lines like Whitman's to the Sunset Breeze, one has to love him. I think we have not yet paid enough attention to the deliberate artistry of the man, not in details, but in the large, end quote. Now, I find that compelling because Sunset Breeze, as well as Unseen Buds, are still considered today to be truly remarkable poems. I myself will make a disclosure in this set of now lectures on the final 31 that when I'm asked, what is your favorite poem of Leaves of Grass, I almost always answer the one I'm reading now. But it is true that Ended Day for me has very special significance that I will share with you when we finally get to that poem. Now we come to the end. It is, of course, going to be fun for us to come to the end and then return to the beginning. And in our very last comments, we will do what T.S. Eliot says in Little Guinea at the end. We shall not cease from exploration. And, of course, he says it, that we will come to discover again what it is that we have seen all the time and yet know it, what does he say? For the first time. I'm convinced that our final study of Leaves of Grass now in these final 31 poems will blow our minds. At least I hope so. Thank you.